Today we're going to talk about different ways to teach grammar in an ESL/EFL classroom. In this video, we'll take a look at how language teachers around the world commonly teach English grammar in their classrooms, where these methods originated, and we'll look at some of the current ways of teaching English grammar in the 21st century. Here's an overview of what we're going to look at today. First, we'll start by doing a quick exercise that asks you to reflect on your own experiences teaching and learning language, and how you understand the way grammar is integrated into a language classroom. Then, we'll have a short history lesson. Don't worry, I'll make it interesting. The idea is to help you understand where the drill type of grammar teaching comes from and how it has evolved through the years. Finally, we'll turn to the focus on form approach of teaching grammar and how it aims to teach grammar, syntax, spelling, and other forms of the English language in a meaningful way through a problem-solving approach. Okay, before we get started, take a moment to answer these questions to yourself. There are no right or wrong answers. It's just to see what you bring to the experience of learning or teaching grammar. First, did you learn grammar when you were a student? If so, was it in your first language? Your second? Have you ever taught grammar to your students? When you plan on teaching, what kinds of grammar do you want to teach? Things like word classes, verb tenses, sentence structure? How do you teach or plan on teaching grammar? By explaining the rule? By asking students to do exercises? Something else? How do you check to see if your students have improved or learned the grammar structure you're working on? Maybe it's through correcting exercises. Perhaps it's giving tests or quizzes. What about listening to student speech to see if they're using the structure correctly? Perhaps you read their writing to see if they're using it. Something else? Have you noticed that many language teachers include specific moments in their lesson plan where they explicitly teach a grammar point? For example, an English language teacher might include notes to teach simple past irregular verbs or review prepositions of place in their lesson plan. Teaching grammar in this way is a deeply ingrained part of our language teaching culture. Let's see where this practice comes from and why it persists today. In order to explore why so many language teachers teach grammar through explicit explanations and drills, we have to go back a few centuries and look at how the first language teachers began teaching languages. I've taken all the ideas for this short history lesson from the introduction to Nasaji and Fotis' excellent book, Teaching Grammar in Second Language Classrooms. Our story starts in the late 1700s, when all the best families had private tutors. Yep, homeschooling, to teach their offspring the essential subjects: Greek, Latin, mathematics, and geography. The middle class began sending their children to grammar schools, believe it or not, that's what they were called, to get an education as well. Languages at this point in history were taught almost scientifically. It was assumed that all languages, including English, could be divided into parts of speech. Rules about these parts of speech were taught explicitly. Students were expected to memorize and recite the rules on command. The main part of a language lesson consisted of translation from Greek or Latin, for example, to English and back again, which is why this method was called the grammar translation method. The vogue for ancient languages died down at the start of the 20th century, although the idea that studying ancient Greek or Latin was the hallmark of a high-class education persisted until recently. Just ask your parents or grandparents. Then, World War II happened. All of a sudden, governments recognized that having citizens who spoke the languages of their enemies gave them a huge tactical advantage. Intelligence services began not only actively recruiting polyglots, that is, people who speak more than one language, they also began studying how languages can be taught and learned more effectively. Not surprisingly, perhaps, they quickly realized that memorizing rules and translating text didn't work very well if you wanted to function with any fluency in a modern language. At this time, modern psychology was really coming into its own. Psychologists like Freud, Skinner, Piaget, and Pavlov were publishing and influencing popular culture and education. The audiolingual method of language learning, for example, was heavily influenced by the psychological theory of Pavlovian conditioning. According to this theory, learning could be understood as a kind of stimulus response, which, when repeated, would lead to habit formation. The idea was that if you said the same things over and over again, you'd eventually be able to say them without thinking about it. Kind of like saying, je m'appelle, je m'appelle, je m'appelle, until it becomes automatic. Curriculum designers in this method taught language focusing on grammatical structures in what they considered a measured and lockstep manner, from simple forms to more complex forms. At each stage, students would hear and repeat key phrases over and over again until they were acquired. These methods had some success and are still used in language learning today. Just think of those language learning apps and programs where you listen and repeat. So, what was the problem with the audiolingual method? Why don't we continue to use it? Well, as you might have guessed, the problem was that the approach didn't really work when students were placed in situations where their stock phrases couldn't be used. Spontaneous conversation that required an agility with the language was very difficult. The main issue was that in these approaches, the focus was still on learning grammatical structure, not on the development of real-life communication skills. Other approaches based on different psychological theories emerged. These included the reading approach, the oral and situational method, the silent way, and total physical response. Each of these methods had different theories about how humans learned language. Each worked with different degrees of success for different teachers and different learners. All, however, continued to base their approach in grammar, the structure and form of the language. All included an analysis of things like verb tenses. None of them focused primarily on real-life communication. The most popular practice to emerge in the 20th century, and one that's still widely used today, is the PPP structure. This is a teaching approach that uses a 3-stage sequence to teach grammar: a presentation stage, a practice stage, and a production stage. In the presentation stage, a new grammar rule or structure is introduced through a text, dialogue, or a story. Then, in the practice stage, students are given various kinds of exercises to repeat, manipulate, or reproduce. Finally, in the production stage, learners are encouraged to use the rules freely and in more communicative activities. The overall aim of the PPP approach is automatic and spontaneous use of language. So, here's the issue. How well does the PPP reach its goal? Does teaching grammar explicitly in these 3 stages generally result in learning a language rule spontaneously? I don't know about you, but when I taught ESL in high school, I used to get very frustrated when I would spend hours planning a lesson, exercises, and quizzes on a form like the third person's S in the simple present tense, only to have the students write things like, he go to the store the next time they wrote a text, or say it the next time they spoke to me in English. So why didn't this work? The problem with the PPP approach, and many of the others preceding it, is that it assumes people can learn to communicate accurately and spontaneously simply by learning grammar rules. If we stop to think about this a second, we'll see that this doesn't make a lot of sense. Most of us learned to speak spontaneously and reasonably accurately in our first languages before we were even old enough to go to school. We continued to speak our languages with enough accuracy to communicate clearly even before our first grammar lesson. So, if the goal of a language education program is to have students produce spontaneous and accurate language forms, then teaching grammar rules on their own like we do in PPP, isn't enough. We need to find more natural ways of learning a language, like we do in the communicative approach. This supposition is supported by over 30 years of research into language acquisition and learning. So, do we drop teaching grammar altogether then? Well, no. Even when language learners are exposed to large amounts of the target language in a natural way, like they are in French immersion programs across Canada, it's still not enough to allow them to fully acquire many aspects of the target language. We have to find some way to teach language communicatively that still include grammar in a meaningful way. So, do we So what are we supposed to do? In the early part of the 21st century, researchers in second language education agreed that an approach was needed that both managed to focus on second language structures within a communicative approach. In other words, we need to strike a balance between teaching grammar explicitly without a communicative context and teaching communicative skills without discussing grammar. The most widely accepted model that managed to do this was called focus on form. Focus on form is also the approach adopted by the Ministry of Education in Quebec in the educational reform of the early 2000s. It is an integral part of Competency 3, Writes and Produces Text. Let's take a closer look at focus on form. Here's an excerpt from the PFEQ. Take a moment now to read this excerpt from the Programme de Formation de Québec, also known as the PFEQ. This excerpt is taken from the program for ESL Secondary Cycle 2, but it can also be found more or less verbatim in all the ESL programs published by the ministry. Take a few minutes now. You may want to pause the video here to answer these check-in questions. First, what does focus on form include? How do students develop their knowledge of language according to this document? And how is focus on form in a communicative teaching and learning environment done? What does the student do? What does the teacher do? And what do the students become aware of? Hopefully, you were able to figure out that a focus on form approach is different from the PPP approach in a few key ways. First, teachers don't decide to teach a grammar point and then the students learn it. It's the other way around. In the focus on form approach, students communicate in the target language, orally or in written form. Next, the teacher notices mistakes are making while the students are communicating. Finally, the teacher selects one or two mistakes to focus on and correct. That's what the PFEQ means by corrective feedback. It's also why this approach is more learner-centered than previous approaches, because it's based in the learner's needs. It's also why it's adapted to the learner's progression, not determined by the teacher or a curriculum designer. One helpful way to think of it might be as a problem-solving approach, where the teacher runs a diagnostic analyzing the kind of mistakes the student's making. Then the teacher uses their knowledge and expertise of the language to help the students see the mistake through corrective feedback. Once the student recognizes the error, the teacher helps the student learn the correct form and creates or supplies exercises that help the student practice. The student, now aware of the correct form, focuses on using it in future speech and writing. Okay, so focus on form is basically problem solving. But how do we do this realistically in an ESL class of 30 plus students who are all at different levels and all have different problems? Don't panic just yet. We'll take a look and see just how this can be done. As we progress throughout the course, we'll learn how to spot errors in student language, how to prioritize which errors are most important to address first, how to draw students' attention to their mistakes, how to teach students the correct form, how to help them practice the correct form, and how to guide them towards using correct form in future language. We'll also look at how to use the writing process and portfolio in ways that will help students improve their language that are concrete and meaningful. and allow them to see their own progression. Thanks for watching and being forgiving of my mistakes. Stay tuned for the next video where we'll look at how to spot and select errors to focus on.